really great to have you with us. We met like a year or two ago in one of the courses that you were teaching on impact measurement and management. And I thought it would be great to sort of bring in your knowledge and experience and insights for the Rewired community. I think it can be really useful for them. Yeah, so for those in the room, could you maybe just briefly introduce yourself?
To me, yeah, very nice to meet you all. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. It's great to see everybody. Hi. I'm struggling for my words at the moment because I've just been doing a training program all day, and it's about day 7, I think, pretty much consecutive. So I'm very much thinking about nothing but impact measurement and management right now. So maybe it's a good time to have this conversation. So I work with Social Value International, which is a member-based organization with networks in various countries and regions around the world. I also operate as a freelancer, and I support organizations who really want to do measurement and management of impact. And I was literally just on a call with somebody before this who's interested in doing some of this. And it's really nice to see what I think is a shift. And I hope that's what we talk about as well today, a bit of a shift in people's thinking from just measuring, okay, we can all measure impact, to actually wanting to do something with that and build it into how we make decisions. So that's my passion. I'm a bit of a social value geek. I've been doing this now for similar time, so I can see people involved in design. So yeah, hopefully I can share some insights and learn from everybody else along the way. Was based in the UK for most of my life, heading back there for a beautiful winter. On Friday, I'm currently training in Thailand, but very lucky to be based in Indonesia at the moment. So big smile on my face and absolute fear about the cold in my bones on Friday.
Yes. Well, it's nice that you can enjoy the cold for a temporary period
Yeah,
and
that's the only good thing
kind of
about
know
it.
there's light at the end of the tunnel. Um,
Sorry.
but yeah, thanks again for taking the time to be with us here today. And I think we can appreciate as Rewired sort of going deeper into the topic of impact measurement and management, how complex it is, how there are different sort of schools of thought and different approaches within the practice. And given that, I wanted to ask if you were to describe or define impact measurement and management, let's say, to your grandmother during a Christmas dinner, in the spirit of Christmas, of course, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say, sorry, Grandma, here it comes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that is genuinely something my parents often occasionally will ask me, what is it you do? And I still struggle sometimes to actually articulate that. Personally, I'm somebody who advises organizations to do this impact measurement and management thing. If I was to define it, and I'm not sure I can do it in the spirit of Christmas, but in a short way, is to say I think it's two sides of the same coin. One is about supporting us to make decisions, not just to improve impact, to optimize impact. And we should probably unpick what we mean by impact soon as well. But so one side of the coin, optimize or maximize impacts that people experience, the social return that we create through our activities. And on the other side of the same coin is to mitigate or reduce the risk that those decisions or choices that we make are not the best, that they are suboptimal. So on one side, we want to optimize. On the other side, we want to mitigate the risk that we're making the wrong choices. And I guess, around that coin, trying to think of a Christmas analogy and failing, but around that chocolate coin is the fact that, we're doing this anyway. We make decisions all of the time. And we make decisions to try and increase value or optimize value with no data, with limited evidence. What we're trying to do is to support what we're doing anyway and give us better information. It's always going to be imperfect, but it's better. It's helping us do what we're already doing, but reduce the risk that the choice that we make is not the best. Sorry, not a short definition. You can see why I struggle to tell my parents after 15 plus years what it is I do. They don't know.
But I think that in any case reflects sort of the process and the practice, because it isn't simple. And I remember speaking with you once, you know, and you said that the management part is really the key part, and it has to be paired with the measurement. And I think that's something that obviously you feel also very strongly about, and I'm hoping we can also expand upon this in the conversation. But before we do that, I kind of wanted to maybe just reflect a bit on where it began for you, actually, and how you got interested in the topic. Because you started doing, you know, research, and you really kind of got into it before, I guess, the trend happened. So I would be interested to hear more about how that journey started for you.
Yeah, I was ahead of my time. No,
Yeah.
you know, it's something you do reflect on. I think as you maybe get a bit older, like, you know, how is it I found myself sat where I am, and I can go further back than, you know, when I started doing this as a bit of an academic or as a practitioner, and actually I think a lot of it stems from my childhood. I grew up in the north of England in coal mining communities, and I saw the sort of the consequences of decisions taken largely about financial value. And what I saw was the sort of the social implications of that. So a lot of coal mines closed, a lot of people lost their jobs with no avenue to go into anything else, and a lot of communities are still suffering. So I think way back when, I was probably subconsciously looking at how decisions affect people in perhaps an unintended way. So fast forward a number of years, and I've gone through my business studies degree and realized I was perhaps being trained to make those decisions, you know, to drive effectiveness, drive efficiency, and equity some way over there. Genuinely thought there's got to be something different out there, and people many years before me had the same thought and done some great work. So yeah, I started studying in this. I was doing a PhD from 2004-5, worked in academia. I sort of, you know, I wasn't fully immersed in academia, I don't think, even when I was there. Fully recovered academic now, I think is what I might say, and very much in that practitioner world. But yeah, I've seen a lot of developments. You know, it was very much about measuring. The conversation has turned very much to managing, and maybe even a third M of maximizing or optimizing. But I think now we're grappling with some. I don't think the measurement piece is too challenging in some ways. You know, there's a set of principles, there's a set of questions, there's some processes we can follow. But actually, the big challenge comes when we say, okay, we've got some evidence, we've got an SROI, we've got some impact results, but so what are we going to do with it? You know, how do we increase our SROI or impact from 2 to 1 to 3 to 1 to 4 to 1? You know, what is it we can actually do internally to use that evidence base? So yeah, I think that's me reflecting on me, you know, a bit of a childhood influence, did some studying, really trying to develop practice alongside the sort of the methodology has been my ambition.
And just you already brought up the SROI, and I think that's something, the social return on investment. If you could maybe just expand upon that a little bit, explain what that is for everyone here.
Sure thing. Yeah. And I mean, I was hesitating a little bit when I said that, you know, when I was saying SROI or impact or social value. But essentially, social value and SROI are very much almost the same thing. So within the social value movement, we share across all the networks a focus on 8 principles of social value. I won't go into each of the 8, but at the core of those principles is the need to involve stakeholders, to understand their changes, understand the significance of their changes, focus on those that are material, and be responsive to them. So we can undertake a social value assessment or impact assessment. We fundamentally involve stakeholders, get qualitative and quantitative evidence. If you want to do SROI, social return on investment, when we value the changes that stakeholders experience from their perspective, value is very much in the eye of the stakeholder. We can understand that value numerically. If we want to also understand that value monetarily, putting a monetary value on, say, a change in a person's financial independence, change in a person's physical, mental health, stress levels, whatever those changes, positive or negative, may be, we can value them, as I say, numerically, and that can also be valued with the language of money. We're not putting a price on stress, we're not putting a price on financial independence, but we're trying to express that value in a language that is familiar to people, but also helps us make comparisons to the investment that generates that social value. So we have the numerator and the denominator, both in a consistent language, the language of money, Thai baht sign in front of it, and Thailand at the moment, a euro sign, a pound sign, a rupiah sign, whichever currency we're working in, and we're better able to compare the value generated to the value that's invested to create that. Another long-winded definition.
Yeah. How do you feel
I'll
like...
try to be more snappy.
No, do you feel like organizations have been able to sort of take this up practically, or how is it sort of impacting yeah,
there's some great examples. There are some great examples, but unfortunately, you know, I'm honest and say, you know, the great examples are still, you know, relatively small numbers of them. Now, some organizations might not do a full social return on investment, but they might do impact assessment without that language of money, and that's absolutely fine. If that supports their decision making effectively without monetization, that's good enough. It really is. But yeah, there are a growing number of organizations that do, they might not call it social value, they might call it impact measurement, impact management, but largely following those principles. There's some, I'm very happy to point out some really cool examples. My go-to is always a social enterprise based in Liverpool. That's my adopted home in England. The Furniture Resource Centre Group, FRC Group. And for 20 years or so, they've been doing impact assessments, and they've really, really led the way, I believe, in embedding SRI and social value into decision making, so that, you know, the information really does affect decisions. There's some cool impact investors doing some bits that are really good, and maybe areas they still need to improve. So yeah, there's definitely some good examples out there, but I'm an eternal optimist. You know, I look into the 5-year future, the maybe 10-year future, and I do genuinely believe that impact accounting will become much more of a norm than it is now. You know, there's lots of pressures that are making this happen. And I think one of the big pushes is the legislative changes. You know, European non-financial disclosure regulations, Social Value Act in the UK, and similar in other places. But I also believe a strong motivator is that organizations are maybe not as quickly as they need to, but recognizing the crises, the multiple crises that we face, and the fact that sustainable development is a mega trend and it's not going to go away. So I think there's a lot of positive pressures encouraging, let's be nice, encouraging organizations to change. So that small number of, you know, great examples will hopefully rapidly expand into a much larger number in the near future.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of to expand a bit, I'm curious more about the sort of external motivators and also the evolving space, because there has been an increase in adoption of impact measurement and management. More people are talking about it, more people are trying to do it. But even so, just kind of if you could paint a picture of what you've been observing, what's new in the space, any interesting or positive evolutions that you would like to highlight a bit more?
Yeah, sure. Just making notes to remember as I ramble through these things. Yes, there's a lot of external motivators. I think internal as well. You know, I think more and more people working for organizations are demanding that they work for a more responsible employer. Again, legislation is changing. I think consumer pressures are naturally changing as well. But again, I do think there's a recognition of, business as usual is not something that is sustainable for the business value, not just as a nice thing, a normative thing to do. It's actually being recognised as probably the next mega trend. And I think those organisations that don't adapt to what is required will be like those organizations that did not adapt to the need for digitalization. They will go the way of the Blockbusters and the Kodaks of the world that failed to adapt and harness what is required. So there's some real positives, but maybe before that, I might highlight not a negative, but perhaps a challenge that I think a lot of us are facing. So we're all in this alphabet soup. I work with SVI, there's ESG reporting, I work with the UNDP, and there's GRI, and many, many others. IMP, that's and I think we've got to look at, what's the fundamental purpose for wanting to do this, wanting to measure our impacts. And as I said at the very beginning, two sides of the same coin. One is about optimizing the well-being of people. That's what we're talking about with impacts. It's about the effects on people and planet well-being. If we have a motivation to optimize that, maximize that, basically create as much good stuff as we can and minimize as much of the bad stuff as we can, then there are a set of principles, and I've mentioned those, that really do help us do that. But there are other approaches out there that perhaps are not so well suited to delivering those ambitions. And I would absolutely put ESG reporting in that area. And I know I'm being heavily critical, and there might be people on the line who want to fight me on this, and I'm happy to have a conversation. I don't think we should throw ESG out, environmental, social, and governance reporting. The S in ESG really could and should be more than it currently is. I think we see, there's a massive amount of ESG reporting, but if you look at the trajectory that we are on at the moment, we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not going to address hunger, inequalities, and so on. So there's a bit of a disconnect. We've got a lot of investment and attention on ESG, but not a lot of progress. In fact, actually quite a lot of regression. So something's not working in something that is being adopted by a lot of organizations. Now, I don't think that they're necessarily doing something that I think a lot of organizations are adopting this, thinking that perhaps it can be the driving force to greater sustainability, more equitable future, and greater business value as well. But actually, ESG is very much focused on materiality from the perspective of what is material to the financial performance of the organization. It's really inward focusing. How does the world impact on me as a business? Whereas the world of impact management, what we're talking about is, yes, we want to know what impacts the organization, but we also want to know how the organization impacts the world. What effects are we creating, again, on people and planet? So I do believe again, we're not throwing ESG out, but I think the S could be so much better. And to do that is about focusing not on activities and outputs alone. It's about going further and saying, what are the outcomes of an activity? What are the effects of what we're creating? What's the value of those? What's the contribution that we're creating, the impacts? So there are some amazing, an aside, I've done this training for years, and I always felt guilty. Okay? People would come on a 2-day training course, impact measurement and management, and I'd say at the very end, right, now we've gone through the process, we know how to get the measurement, we know how to do the data collection, and we know it's about decision making, but go figure out how to do that. Go figure out how to embed that in your organization, and that's going to be really hard. We didn't have any guidance. There's no really clear guidance on how to embed that. And I think this is for me, massive development in the last year or so, is it comes from the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme. It's a unit within that called SDG Impact, Sustainable Development. So SDG Impact. And they have created the SDG Impact Standards. Here's some more of the alphabet soup. But what the impact standards are about is saying, look, if you really want to embed sustainable development, if you really want to contribute positively to the SDGs, then here are some really clear steps on how to do that. It's broken down, the standards are broken down into 4 themes. Each of the 4 themes has some business actions, and there are some practice indicators underneath. Now, there's a range of indicators. Each one is such common sense. You know, we need to commit to sustainable development. Well, the leaders need to make a firm commitment. We need to understand, okay, well, we need to do some research. So each indicator taken in its, you know, as an individual, is just common sense. When we look at the whole list of indicators, it might look a little bit daunting. And the reality is it's probably going to take, you know, the most sustainable, most equitable company in the world a year or 2 to achieve the whole set. But it's a really good roadmap for every organization. So I don't feel guilty anymore. In training now, I can say, look, this is the scope of the training. You need to do more. You need to think about governance and strategy. But here is a really good source of information. And the impact standards, they're open source. It's a self-assessment. So any organization can conduct that self-assessment, do a gap analysis, prioritize what they need to do. Next year, there will be an assurance seal that goes with it as well, optional.
Yeah, I think that now I'm sort of, because now you're saying that the standards are there and the tools are there and the resources are there. And I think as in an ideal world and in a rewired world, you know, each and every organization, big or small, would have impact embedded in their DNA, in their organization. But you can see that it's not really happening as much as we would like it to be. So expanding on what you've just said, I'm also curious, why do you think some organizations haven't taken this step yet? What is needed for more organizations to do that? And maybe also as an individual, how do we help organizations do that? That's a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I can answer one question quite quickly for once. Why don't organizations do it as much as they should? Because they don't have to. Fundamentally, we are not held accountable for our social impact or our environmental impacts to the same degree we are for our financial impacts. If we don't perform as we should do with financial performance, if we're in a for-profit organization, we lose the job. The investor goes somewhere else. Something happens. We are held accountable. There are consequences. If I don't deliver on my social performance, it's unlikely that I'm held to account. It's very unlikely that I, as a decision maker, experience any risk. The stakeholders, yeah, they absolutely experience the risk. We've not optimized their lives. We've potentially made some of their lives even worse. But we're not measuring that very effectively, so we don't know. We are measuring it, but we're not setting targets, so we're not holding me to account. So I think that's very much why we've not seen the scale of change that's required. So if I was to be very honest and say what needs to change, it's legislation and it's regulation. I've reached a point in time now where I'm still optimistic. I think we've given organizations enough time to do it voluntarily. And I think now is the time to force their hand a little bit more. And it's happening. But again, you know, legislation is a slow process. So I've seen things in the UK, Indonesia, India, Taiwan, and other places. But you know, it's a small bit of legislation. It's a small change. But I do think over time that will continue to grow and it will continue to have sharper teeth. But I think that I'm hopeful that the quicker driving force is actually more of a sort of more mimetic pressures where organization A does it. So organization B goes, well, if they're doing it, we should clearly be doing it because they've demonstrated the value of it. And I do think the more proactive organizations are seeing that it's not just, again, I've said this, not just a nice thing, but actually crucial to the survival and value creation of that business, of that organization. So I think legislation is the key, and there'll be some sort of front-running organizations that run with this. You know, again, there's some good examples out there, but not enough. What can we do as individuals? Well, we can always vote with a euro in our pocket, a dollar in our pocket. That's always something we can do. I think within the organizations that we work for with, I think there's a lot of championing that we can do. I heard of an example recently, actually. It was based in Singapore. It's a huge corporate organization whose name I genuinely cannot remember. And their chair or chief exec basically changed the whole culture of the organization to be one about sustainability because his children had criticized him for the organization's performance, essentially saying, you're destroying my legacy as a human being, if you like. And that was the driving force to change what is a huge organization's way of thinking. So I do think, if you've got a parent who's a chief exec of a huge global conglomerate, please do have a conversation with them. But I do think, within the organizations we work with, we work for, we have a growing opportunity to show a different way of doing things. But to your point, Priscilla, earlier, the guidance is there largely. The frameworks are there, the tools are there. I think now is the time to just, put up or shut up almost, and by shut up, I mean, accept doom that we face. So I don't think we should do. We should change. I get frustrated, I must admit, when I hear of endless organizations saying we need to create an impact management framework or a way of doing it. And I think, no. You don't need to. You can adapt to what's out there, but you don't need to start. We don't need to recreate the wheel. The wheel's been created. It's got plenty of spokes. There's a nice analogy, but it's time to do. It really is time to do. And there's organizations out there that we can learn from. But as much as we've been doing this for a while now, we're still in that, unfortunately, pioneering phase. The people in this call, we should recognize where we're at. Still pretty much leading a lot of the conversations. So don't expect there to be many cases that you can turn to. Be that case. Be the case in the world you want to see.
Yeah. I think also on that point, there was one sort of question that Olga and I also had discussed that was a little bit more practical as individuals that we were also curious to hear more from you about. So, a lot of times we have these claims and impact reports that we're seeing these days, which sometimes, it makes it a bit hard to know what to believe or what not to believe. So we were just curious to hear if you have any tips on how we can be critical when reading information, in sustainability reports or impact reports, what to look for, what to ask ourselves, any red flags, any green flags. So it's a bit more of a practical question.
Yeah, I like how you bite your tongue. There's some very, very dodgy reports out there, aren't there? I read them too often. Yeah, I think the first thing to do is flick to the front of the report, turn it over and look for the assurance statement. Look for that statement of independence that says this work has been scrutinized by somebody else. We produce financial accounts. If you're looking to read a set of financial accounts to inform your decision making, you would check the assurance statement. If we're an investor looking to choose between A and B, I mean, okay, they're both audited. Okay, I can read them now and help make my decision. If there wasn't that assurance statement in a financial account, you would throw it in the bin. Probably nothing more than marketing. Is there a difference when we talk about sustainability reports, social accounts, whatever language you want to do? I think there's a really significant risk if I'm marking my own homework. Even if I'm an independent consultant who's been paid by somebody to be an independent consultant, I'm going to make a set of judgments. The principles, they're not rules. I've got to make a judgment on sample size, on method applied, and a range of others. So my judgments should be assessed by somebody independent, somebody who's qualified. So that would definitely be the first thing. And I think anything without that it is a bit of a red flag. Now, it's not a big market, report assurance. Social Value International do offer that service. I've got to say that. But it doesn't mean you have to go to SVI. There'll be others out there who can do that. In terms of, if it has or hasn't been assured, you've still got to look at the quality of the report. There'll be some very good non-assured reports, as there are probably some reports that are not great that have been assured, perhaps. But I think you've got to look at it from the perspective of the principles. So I will stick forever, in answering questions to the principles of social value. To what extent have stakeholders, particularly those affected by decisions, been involved in identifying the outcomes, the value of those, and so on? To what extent is it the author of the report, the analyst or the project manager, whoever it may be, what level of assumption are they making? I've seen statements that go, oh, we did not involve this stakeholder group because they don't have good educational levels. That's an outrageous statement. That's your failing as an author, as a researcher. Get better and work with others who can facilitate. So I think there are lots of easy excuses out there. We did not involve stakeholders because, therefore, we've made a lot of assumptions that tell you how good I am. I think they're big red flags. Limited scope, only looking at beneficiaries, no negative outcomes. I think that's a bit of a used car sales pitch, isn't it? This project creates nothing but positive returns. Trust me, I run the project. So yeah, assurance, to what extent are stakeholders involved? To what extent does materiality cover positive intended, as well as positive unintended and negative unintended changes?
I think that's something that we'll all take as food for thought, definitely going forward. So on that note, I think I'll just hand it over to the rest of the room for any more questions.
Thank you. So please shout at me, guys. Get me off my high horse.